Hi, this is Madeline Gustafson, and I'll just be quickly explaining the maps I made as an accompaniment to my digital project on H. Holmes and the newspaper articles that we had scraped based on him and other mass murderers in American history in the late 19th century. Um, but I am specifically focusing on H. Holmes and the proliferation of articles based on him across the country. So the first map I made, I'll explain very quickly. Um, it's just basically a county population map. I had taken the data from the US decennial census from 1890. So what we see here, the patterns of urbanization are pretty much as expected in 1890. Lots of the population is centered in New England area, the original 13 colonies, particularly in the northern area of New England. Um, we see really deep red in Pennsylvania, in New York, in New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, etc. So the darkest red here means a population of 100,000 or more in the county. I decided to have the upper limit as 100,000 because otherwise we would see almost no distinction in between the colors because some counties just had so many more people than others, for example, in New York. So yeah, the darkest red means 100,000 or more. Lightest red means anywhere from 0 to 10,000 people. So, aside from New England, there's also some pockets of urbanization, densely populated counties in the upper Midwest area. So we see in Michigan here, in Illinois, so Cook County, Kane, LaSalle. In Michigan, we see some deep red as well. And then scattering into the Great Plains as they got increasingly colonized. So here in Missouri, we see Jackson has over 160,000 people. Over here in Louisiana, Alabama gets a little bit darker as well. And then, of course, on the West Coast, we have Los Angeles as the biggest source of population, most densely populated county on the West Coast by 1890. And then we also see counties like Alameda and King, which is where Seattle is located, as pretty dark red. But otherwise, in the middle, it's pretty empty. Salt Lake in Utah is probably the biggest city, most densely populated county in the sort of Great Plains frontier region. And as we see, a lot of counties are still getting drawn. So, for example, in Oklahoma, it was technically Indian territory. That's in quotations. In 1890, so not a state yet, technically. And we see just the beginning of the drawing of counties with no population, but the counties are listed. That's just how it was in the decennial census, which is interesting. And then we see too in Montana, the more frontier region here, a lot of counties not drawn yet. And another thing that was really frustrating in mapping this is that in the Dakotas, a lot of these counties are extinct, or a lot of the counties that are in the 1890 census are either extinct or have been renamed or amalgamated with other ones. So I had to amalgamate them in their existing ones. So I had to research for each county its existing name as of 2018 because Tableau has no capabilities of historical mapping. So that was pretty frustrating in the Dakotas as that is getting figured out in the 1890s. But generally what we see here are what we expect in terms of results. Urbanization, densely populated in New England, densely populated in pockets of the Midwest, Great Lakes region, and then West Coast, cities we recognize today. And then the frontier is pretty empty. So now we'll switch to the second map I had made using Tableau. So something that was very frustrating with Tableau is that I couldn't combine these two maps because they had different dimensions. So I plotted this map on the basis of articles per city, whereas the census is per county. So if I were to combine them, I would lose the specific longitude and latitude, I suppose, of where these articles were found, because I would have to group them in within counties instead of based on the town or city where it was published in the first place. So I decided to leave them separate. And yeah, so this is the proliferation of H.H. Holmes articles in the United States between 1894 and 1896. So the first thing I want to point out is the legend here. So the biggest bubble means 78 articles. The biggest bubble belongs to St. Paul, Minnesota, and the rest decrease in size. So anywhere from 1 to up to 78 articles. So I guess the next thing I should point out is what I expected to see, which is a lot of articles in the biggest cities. So here in Seattle, it's a pretty big bubble. St. Paul is a pretty big bubble. Minneapolis is this teeny one inside it, but St. Paul and Minneapolis are just across the river from each other. So mapping these plot points, now I realize that they probably shared in circulation, which makes sense. Salt Lake has a pretty big one. Over here on the East Coast, Washington saw a lot of articles between 94 and 96, as did New York and Jersey City, as did Waterbury, Connecticut, and New Haven. Saw Washington, some big industrial cities in Pennsylvania that aren't necessarily what comes to mind when we think of bustling metropolises in 2018, but cities such as Scranton and Shenandoah in Pennsylvania were huge industrial cities, so that makes sense. Roanoke, Virginia, similar and very important in the first century and a half of American history. Maysville, Kentucky is one of the anomalies here. It is a very tiny little town. There's a population of just over 3,000 people by 1890, and yet they saw 38 articles, which is, similar to a city such as Jersey City, which had over 100,000 people at the time. So that's an interesting anomaly, as is the Dalles, Oregon, which is another anomaly that I point out in my paper, that saw 24 articles, and they have just over 2,000 people population-wise. So those are really interesting, and I think that they could be a really fascinating additional project. If I had more time, I would do a deeper delve into what the journalistic tendencies of those two cities look like between 94 and 96, whether they were increasing urbanization, whether the publishers had some sort of agreements with the big city publishers in New York and Washington where they're reprinting. So that'd be very interesting, as it is pretty inconsistent with the rest of the findings. We see here small scatterings in the southern states that are consistent with size for the time. So we see 1 or 2 articles at most in here, as we do on the frontier region. So Nevada, Carson City saw 3, Elko saw 3, Las Vegas only had 25 people by 1890, so they didn't see any articles, which isn't surprising. And one last thing I should point out is there are some big losses in this map, just having to do with copyright issues with chronicling America. So, for example, Chicago not being here at all is obviously a big loss, considering that H.H. Holmes committed most of his crimes in Chicago, but that's probably due to copyright issues with the Chicago Tribune. Similar with LA. As we saw in the county map, LA was one of the most populous counties at the time, and they have no articles, and I'm assuming that is again because of copyright, and it doesn't mean anything of consequence in terms of the city versus rural divide with H.H. Holmes articles. So that is one big glaring loss in terms of this digital project, but when we combine the two maps, it's clear to see that most trends, I'll zoom in a little bit more actually there, that most trends are consistent with the amount of articles they saw. So the more densely populated the county, the more articles they saw in H.H. Holmes, and I did a more thorough analysis in my paper, but essentially my conclusion is that it comes down to associational versus sensational journalism. So someone like H.H. Holmes, who had committed a gruesome crime, it getting proliferated in the bigger cities, signals a switch to sensational journalism, whereas the smaller towns, such as in the southern states and the frontier, were using their newspapers for associational purposes, And so we're less interested in publishing sensational stories such as the crimes of Holmes. So that's it. Thanks so much.